Welcome everyone to this SSH webinar. As some of you may know, SSH stands for the Social Sciences and Humanities Network. And the SSH network is a network that aims to engage more SSH experts and knowledge in IPES. My name is Håkon Aspe. I'm part of the SSH network, and today I am your host. So we're very pleased and excited to announce today's speaker. Esther Turnhout has held the position of professor at the University of Twente since September 2021. She is also the chair of Science, Technology and Society at the section of Science, Technology and Policy Studies at the BMS faculty. Before moving to Twente, she spent 18 years at the Wageningen University, since 2016 as professor in the Politics of Environmental Knowledge at the Forest and Nature Conservation Policy Group. Professor Turnhout is an interdisciplinary social scientist with expertise in science and technology studies, environmental studies, and political science. Much of her research focuses on biodiversity science and governance. She plays several active roles in the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPES, and was an author of the IPES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that was launched in 2019. So with that, I will end my sharing and give the word to you, Esther.
So thank you all for having me, and thank you for joining this webinar. So in this short talk, I will talk a little bit about what I think needs to change in practices of scientific research in order to better contribute to the transformative changes in our economies, in our societies, in our environments as well, that we believe, that IPES also believes is necessary for a sustainable future where both humans and non-humans can flourish. I also put here as a subtitle the question why we are not making more progress in actually transforming environmental science to those ends, because actually calls to change scientific practices to better support society are really not that new. So the question is, why aren't we doing it already, and what is actually stopping us? Which I think is a key element of understanding transformative change as a scientist, but also understanding transformation of science itself. The key question we need to ask is, why aren't we doing it already? What are actually the obstacles? What are the power relations, the values, and the interests that are preventing us from making the changes that we do believe are necessary for this? So if you've been paying attention to science, policy, society relations for the past, decades, I think you've seen a clear trend in which the question whether to engage or not with society is really no longer a question. There is widespread support for the need to engage, be relevant for the societal changes and policy decisions. In many ways, the ideal of the ivory tower, where scientists produce their knowledge separate from those considerations, remains lurking around the corner, I would say. But discourse is really shifting in the direction of an appreciation and a recognition of the importance of participation. One of the key bodies in which this trend towards participation has been embraced is, for example, the global research program Future Earth, where they say that to build and connect global knowledge, to intensify the impact of research, and to find new ways to accelerate sustainable development, central to achieving that vision is co-production, which means the collaboration between experts and societal partners. So clearly engagement and participation have become accepted. At the same time, although the step made by Future Earth is important, it's really also not very new. I took, for example, this quote from a 2010 book where a very similar claim about the importance to change science, to relinquish, as the quote says, its modernistic claims to truth and the monopolistic presumptions that go with that. Science must open up. It must allow insight in their workings, and it must be made transparent, and it must engage and be much more closely bound to other subsystems of civil society. So with this notion of co-production so central to the vision of Future Earth, with these calls to change scientific practice having been around for such a long time, the question really becomes, if we still have to say this, why is it that we're not making more progress in that direction, and what is actually stopping us? And in this talk, I'll build quite a bit on two recent articles that we did together with Marianne Laassen, where we really tried to understand where conservative forces, so forces actually prevent change of science, are coming from, and what is keeping them in place. And there's a variety of answers to this question, and I'll go through a few of them in this talk. So one clear answer to the question of why we are not making more progress is that despite the calls for participation and engagement, we also still have this. So we also still have a quite prominent ideal or contract of how science and policy should relate, which is called the linear model, where science is portrayed as producing objective knowledge, feeds that into society because it has been produced separate from that society, which then provides the best conditions to come out with rational decisions. So this linear model has not been abandoned. It is, for example, quite clearly articulated in global environmental science bodies like the IPCC and also IPBES. So in a couple of years ago, we did a literature review study of the different ways in which IPBES, which is an organization that does aim seriously and sincerely for the inclusion of alternative forms of knowledge that are not natural sciences or quantitative, so that objectives to be inclusive of diverse ways of knowledge, including the social sciences and humanities, but also include indigenous and local knowledge systems. So despite that sincere ambition, IPBES is actually constrained in the way in which they're able to actually accommodate those perspectives. And in this article, we've identified 3 reasons for why this is the case. One, I will not go into that much, involves rules for how IPBES selects experts and how rules of IPBES also define in which these experts can participate. So I will not go into that that much, but I will go into the other 2 ways in which IPBES actually limits diversity, dominant ways of working and the drive to consensus. So IPBES assessments work according to a specific structure. And this structure can be recognized also in the chapter structure of assessments, and it's basically derived from what is called the Dipsier model. And I put an old and not very good picture here, but I guess it does the trick in sort of showing how the model works. So first of all, you have drivers of biodiversity loss, for example, in the case of IPBES. which create pressures, which then alter, which then affect the state of biodiversity, which has all kinds of impacts on species and humans, which would then create policy responses that address those driving forces and pressures. So this kind of reasoning is quite causal, and it's also quite mechanistic, and it's positivist. And what I mean by that, and I'll go into that a little bit more later on in this talk, is that it looks at singularity, right? So the state of biodiversity of the planet, as if that's a unit that can be expressed in a more or less coherent and consistent way. So this mechanistic reductionist worldview kind of splits up the world into predefined categories that are causally related, and also has a fixed idea of interdisciplinarity, because it has predefined categories of where knowledge can and should fit. So a lot of the policy science expertise goes in the responses chapter. It's not, so for example, the analysis of what's happening to biodiversity is often not considered to be a social science topic, which again brings us back to also predefined ideas of who biodiversity experts are. Generally, I would not be considered to be a biodiversity expert. So these kinds of prefix notions already sort of define where knowledge can fit, and it can only fit, and this is quite important, if it subscribes to the mechanistic and reductionist worldview, that it's actually firmly institutionalized in the way in which it best does assessments. Now, apart from the fact that it kind of disciplines the role of SSH disciplines, there's also some other problems with the kind of knowledge that is created through these models of interdisciplinarity and these models of assessments. And I'll go into that a little bit as well. But what we see, of course, is that if you look at the words in the figure, particularly the bolded words, those are very abstract global aggregates. It's very difficult to actually translate those into questions of responsibility and accountability, for example. And in that way, this way of presenting environmental science also contributes to depoliticization. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. One of the ways in which depoliticization happens is that as part of the science-society contract, as part of the linear model within which IPBES operates, what heavily features in that contract is the idea of neutrality, where basically the production of truthful, authoritative, credible, or reliable knowledge is based on the assumption that these bodies have to be neutral. Now, we can have an epistemological debate about whether value neutrality is possible, which we can totally do. But I would also stress that operating on the premise of neutrality in practice results in reproducing the status quo and serving vested interests. So whether or not you adhere to the ideal of neutrality, operating on the basis that you have actually accomplished neutrality is really very risky. And the quotation here by Julia Steinberger makes it very clear. She talks about IPCC modeling and how in the models, things that do not exist, like carbon removal technologies, are being calculated in those models. because under the idea of neutrality, it would not be a problem for modelers to model the potential carbon benefits or climate benefits of these non-existent technologies. But at the same time, what you do see happening is that despite the fact that these technologies do not exist, their imagined benefits are currently being used to delay decarbonization. And they have, of course, played a massive role to the mess that we find ourselves in currently, with all the talk about net zero, where a lot of that net zero is made to be dependent on these non-existent technologies. So she argues that actually by trying to be neutral in a politicized domain, the IPCC makes itself extremely vulnerable to capture by dominant interests that have politicized climate change and that has politicized decarbonization and carbon emission reduction measures. So all in all, the established mode of working in these global expert bodies constitutes something like a locked-in situation where the continued reproduction of this linear model, so of this contract between science, policy, and society, is not something that is convenient for experts because they can pretend actually to stay away from the policy values and simply do the calculations. It's also demanded by policymakers, and it is institutionalized in the way in which bodies like IPBES and IPCC do environmental assessment processes, where the basic idea is that both have to believe in a singular world for science to represent and assess, and for policymakers to govern. And that worldview, which is very much a scientific worldview of singularity, resonates really well with ontologically singular, positivist, reductionist paradigms, creates a situation where both scientists and policymakers cannot escape out of. And what it produces is the exclusion of perspectives and worldviews and knowledge systems that do not fit with this. What it also produces is knowledge that lacks actionability and serves the status quo. So for these two reasons, it is important to start critically reflecting on the importance of breaking out of this, but also the inherent challenges and obstacles involved in doing so. And for me, the question really is whether an IPBES can actually break out of it. And if the answer to this is no, it cannot, the question is, what is it that we are supporting here as experts? And to me, that's an open question, but it's a question that I ask myself quite regularly, and increasingly regularly also within the process of creating the transformative change assessment. So what you see in IPBES is very well known. I should also probably emphasize. It's been the problems of inclusion and diversity while actually ignoring power relations, so ignoring that already the framework for inclusion and diversity has been created by dominant paradigms and knowledge systems. The prioritization of integration of different knowledge systems according to these preset assessment frameworks. And the idea of IPBES that it needs to speak with one voice, with consensus knowledge. All of these points that I've put here in the slides have been for a very long time, been documented in studies about participatory processes in general, co-production processes in knowledge production, but also, of course, feminists, intersectional studies. So inclusion and the aim to be inclusive and diverse. While you ignore power, you prioritize integration and consensus, and you have already predefined what diversity means, leads inevitably to the cooptation and reduction of the diversity that you aim to include. And this is well known. So it's really a pity that global expert bodies are failing to actually make more progress here. And it does beg the question of why is it so difficult to prevent these very well known, very well documented problems? Now, in our assessment, did we also write about in our book, one answer to the question of why we're still making these mistakes is related to an underappreciation of the role of framing, which leads to the reproduction of these problematic norms for science, objectivity and neutrality, and these problematic norms for science policy society relations that are organized along the linear model. So framing is also a very well-known concept from the social sciences and humanities. Applied to science, it basically aims to communicate that facts cannot speak for themselves. Any presentation of facts involves values. And facts and values then entwine in frames about what the research problem is, for example. But these frames then also go on to define what solutions are possible, and they define what is seen as relevant knowledge. Framing is what makes that science policy society contract so sticky and difficult to break out of. It is the glue, so to say, that of the lock-ins that I've been discussing about. What it also means that when a frame, for example, a frame of how the world works according to Dipsier categories, becomes reproduced a lot, it is seen as truth or reality. It's no longer seen as a frame, which means actually that existing inequities and power relations between knowledge systems not just are reproduced and certain frames gain dominant over potential other frames, even more so, the dominant frames are no longer seen as frames. And this justifies the exclusion and marginalization of alternative modes of knowledge production or alternative modes of doing an assessment, for example, or alternative ideas about what biodiversity is and consists of. I've also, in another article, I've called this measurementality, where actually specific frames of biodiversity and ecosystem services work not just to influence policy decisions, but also influence science and research, creating these continued feedback loops, where the only knowledge that is produced is knowledge that conforms to that frame, where the only decisions that are made also conform to that frame, creating the situation where the frame is no longer a frame, the frame is reality, because all the alternatives are marginalized and excluded. So that's the lock-in between science and policy in the case of IPBES. So the answer here to why we're not transforming science is because of this locked-in situation. And this locked-in situation is difficult to break out of because it directly affects vested interests in science that have made their career in IPCC and IPBES, for example, that have created these interdisciplinary frameworks, that have invested time, money, and resources into the models that do the calculations. So existing habits, privileges are hard to kick for everybody, and that is also true for science. it is also because of a lack of a recognition of framing that we are not making more progress in transforming science to ways that would actually that have the potential to be more useful in supporting transformative change. And this is due to the lack of recognition of framing, which results in norms of good science like neutrality and objectivity being taken for granted. Because, and one of the ways in which that works out in practice is that neutrality in practice often means that you take for granted dominant frames. Because questioning them and saying, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing something else, is seen as political. And neutral means accepting them. And it also means, again, due to a lack of recognition of framing and this locked-in situation, results in the reproduction of norms of good science policy society relations, where we have to recognize that the situation that I outlined just now in the previous slide. So here, if you look at this situation, if that works well, a lot of practitioners in science policy interfaces will see this as success. They will see the situation where science and research produces exactly the knowledge that policies and decision maker ask of us, and then policy and decision making prioritizes research into the categories that they consider to be relevant. They consider this to be an effective science policy interface. So science policy interactions are seen as effective when knowledge production and knowledge use fit into a shared singular problem frame. So again, this is how that locked-in situation is reproduced. Because saying that we should be doing something different is then seen as very risky for scientists, because they are afraid that they'll be seen as political. They will also lose their policy audience. They risk losing the ear of the policymakers that they've been so trained in servicing. But I would say ultimately, despite my, I do understand that it's nice if science and policy speak the same language and are able to communicate. I'm not against that, but ultimately my conclusion is that this is a problem. Dominant values, interests, and knowledge systems are reinforced because not questioning them is seen as neutral, while questioning them is seen as political. The example of Julius Steinberger and carbon removal technologies makes it very clear. And as a result, the exclusion of, and cooptation or assimilation of marginalized perspectives and knowledge systems is normalized and justified. And in so doing, refusing to actually break out of that locked-in situation, reducing and excluding diversity in the ways that I've talked about, I would say that global environmental science has actually become an obstacle for transformation. It's become an obstacle for its own transformation for the reasons I've outlined so far. But I would say it's also become an obstacle for transformative change for biodiversity itself, because the knowledge that comes out of these assessments is quite obviously, I would say, inactionable, because it allows actors to evade responsibility behind the global aggregate concepts such as drivers. Instead of attribution, for example, that would also be possible. Instead of being more specific, the use of the Dipsier model actually creates and you see that in other fields as well, where a lot of the knowledge about transformations or that claims to be about transformation is extremely abstract and theoretical and conceptual and well, not very actionable. So what is needed to go forward is a couple of things, I would say, and also these sort of conclusions are not new, but we need to start disempowering dominant approaches to environmental knowledge. And I'm quite serious when I say this, and I'm fully aware of what this means. But it has been my experience that change is not possible by only doing the second point. So by only trying to empower critical social sciences and humanities. If you don't actively dismantle the dominant frames and approaches, what you will end up doing if you aim to empower critical social sciences and humanities, you will empower them to be effective in that dominant frame. So you will only end up serving to strengthen this dominant approach that is so maladaptive. We need to also remake the science policy contracts and abandon the linear model in a way that actually recognizes that the creation of knowledge is inherently political and involves value-laden choices and also requires accountability, and to also reorganize knowledge policy relations so that that political dimension is visible and can be actively discussed. And fourthly, we need to step away from the idea that bodies like IPBES are able to and should have as their mission to represent global aggregates, to represent the Earth or the planet or biodiversity as a whole, and recognize pluralism in our understanding of basically all the concepts that go into an assessment, and allowing for contestation and disagreement between them. So, and with this I will conclude. There's 3 points of attention, I would say, in knowledge production practices, if they are serious about aiming to support transformative change instead of just calling for it. And if they are willing to also submit themselves to the needed transformations. So the first is power. We need to be attentive of unequal power relations and address them openly. We need to make space to discuss and deliberate radical difference. So pluralism. And third, politics. We need to start questioning dominant framings. We need to address political dimensions. We need to reflect on the in and exclusions that knowledge production inevitably produces. And we need to engage wider political context beyond the national delegations that adopt our summaries for policymakers if we're really serious about engendering positive changes. And of course, I guess this goes without saying, this involves the decolonization of an expert body like IPBES. But then really the question is, given the mandates, given the organization, given the entire cultural system in which IPBES is embedded, is that even possible? Or yeah, can something like IPBES be decolonized? And if the answer is no, what should that then mean for us? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esther. That was a really inspiring and convincing talk, I think.